They're eating the dogs. They're eating the dogs. I couldn't help myself.
Oh, we're keeping that in. Holy shit.
I did
Oh,
that for you because
I
I knew
appreciate
that
it.
you'd get a kick out of it. Well,
Oh,
how you doing, my friend?
I feel a little better now. That shit is hilarious. It shouldn't be, but it is hilarious.
It was pretty
And just for
funny.
the record, no one is eating dogs and cats and pets, and like it's all bullshit. So we'll just leave that at
We'll see. You never know.
that. I saw it on TV.
Television.
Oh,
Well, I hear you got some shout outs for today, my
I
friend.
got one shout out to my lovely sister. That's it. Shout out to her. She was upset she didn't get a shout out in the last episode, so she can get her shout out at the very beginning.
Cool. I got one shout out too. I know a couple of episodes back, we shouted out Uncle Calvin, my father in law, but also his wife Amy listens to a ton of
Mhm.
these episodes and has been a huge supporter too. So I wanted to spread the love to her.
Hell yeah.
Uh, Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening, Amy. What do we got today? What are we talking about?
I don't know, man. What are we?
We didn't even
Just
make an
kidding.
episode. Yeah.
We're just gonna ramble and just
Yeah.
make stuff up for 30 minutes
Oh
and
God. I
call it
would ask
good.
people to turn it off if we did that. Well, what we really are talking about, we've done this episode in the past. We actually did this long time ago, back before we are what we are today. But I told Justin it might be a good idea to bring it back. It is that time of the year. This impacts a portion of the country. I didn't look up what region specifically, but it is prevalent, and it's seasonal affective disorder. I live in Oregon. Justin's in Colorado, except I think Justin actually Colorado gets a lot of sun technically, like in
300 days
general.
a
But
year.
yeah, but Oregon does not, and I think we're hitting that patch where we're mostly going to have clouds between now and like March or April. I personally love this weather, but not everybody does. And after having a very sunny and warm summer, we start to experience changes. A lot of people start to experience changes. It is a very real thing. I do see a lot of teens working, in the different clinics I've worked at or different at the hospital and now at the school, that definitely have sat or are impacted by the weather. Maybe it's not full blown seasonal affective disorder. But they are impacted. Obviously, another factor, because it does coincide with the start of school, is the start of school. So maybe how they're being impacted does have to do more with school being a big stressor. But it is important to notice that this happens, like the changing of the weather. It gets dark really early, like that kind of stuff impacts you. It impacts people. Just think of it this way: here in Oregon, and I know it's similar in other places, but for me, we get to daylight savings time, and next thing I know, the clock hits 4:50 p.m. and it's pitch black. And you do
Oh,
that for, months at a time, weeks at a time, it does start to drain on you a little bit. So there's things you can do. There's ways you can get help, but we kind of wanted to do this as a public service announcement. Seasonal affective disorder is a real thing. We'll actually learn a little more about where it is in the DSM. But actually, before I pass it to you, Justin, I did want to say this is Suicide Prevention Month, and I wanted to acknowledge
mhm.
that it is really important. If you know somebody or are somebody who's struggling, the National Suicide Lifeline 988 is there for you. But really wanted to highlight that it is, I think, an important thing that we acknowledge. It is a tough part of the job that some of our kids, our teens, do deal with that. But yeah, just want to acknowledge that September is Suicide Prevention Month.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point that there are a lot of things going on at this time of the year. School starting, weather's changing, sunlight's changing, and it's a lot stressful, a lot more
Mhm.
stressful. And I noticed that this time of year, it tends to be my busiest time of year because
Yeah.
people are struggling more.
Hmm.
And mental health is going downwards, especially after the high of the summer.
Yeah.
I know personally, I tend to get a little bit down this time of year too. It
Mhm.
really happened for the first time where I thought, like, the first time I really ever thought to myself, like, am I depressed? Was when I was in residency and it was fall and everything was changing after I had a really good summer.
Yeah.
And so I feel it too. The loss of sunlight, summer's ending. There's kind of a melancholy in the air, a certain feel in the air that's just somewhat different.
Hmm.
And so we want to talk about it, help other people understand that it's normal. It's a normal thing that a lot of people go through, and to give you some ideas of how to get help if you feel like this is happening to you too.
Yeah. And to know, like, I don't want to say this. You pretty much just said it, Justin. But just like if this impacts you, there's nothing wrong with you. Like there's,
Yeah.
I think people almost feel like embarrassed of like, oh, the weather makes me sad. Like fuck yeah, it does. It makes people sad. Like it is tough. So it's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But a definition. We'll probably use sad and seasonal affective disorder interchangeably throughout the episode. But seasonal affective disorder is a type of depression that occurs during specific seasons, usually during the fall and winter. It's characterized by a seasonal pattern of depressive episodes that typically start in that late fall or winter time, kind of when like November, December run into each other, January, and then things tend to improve in the spring or in the summer when we get more sunlight.
Seasonal affective disorder is actually better diagnosed as major depressive disorder with seasonal pattern in the DSM-5. So that's like the
Mm-hmm.
official diagnosis. It's a subtype of depression related to mood changes that are linked to seasonal changes. The diagnostic specifier with seasonal pattern can describe a seasonal pattern of symptoms in both major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder, because there's two major types of depression: major
Mm-hmm.
depressive disorder and bipolar depression. And so essentially this can go with either one.
Yeah. So, something I learned in researching, SAD is not actually its own diagnosis in the DSM-5. This was new for me. I pulled up my electronic version of the DSM-5. I did the Control F to try to find seasonal affective disorder and did not find it. And I was like, what the fuck? What are we doing? So then I had to do a quick Google search and I learned something new. You would think at this point I would have a better idea of it, but we learn new shit all the time. So I thought that was pretty cool to share. I like that little like nerding out moment of like, oh, this is new in the DSM, or oh, I had no idea, because I have that book on my desk every single day. So it's fun to learn new things.
And what I think the last time we did this episode was when we were still on the DSM-5 before the text revision, the
Yeah.
TR came out.
Hmm.
So yeah, they
That's how
didn't
long it's
change it
been.
too much. I know that's how long it's been.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's been a couple of years since they added the TR.
Yeah, I was explaining to a student the other day. They saw my big DSM in my bookshelf, and then they're like, "Oh, is that the DSM?" I was like, "It is. Here's my pocket version." They're like, "Wow, that's so cool." I was like, "Yeah, it's interesting because when I was in college, they moved from the 4 to the 5. So that's
Hmm.
now. It was in 2013, I think, is when the change came. So now we're 11 years later. Who knows when the next one is, because I don't know how much time was between the 3 and the 4. 11 years feels like a chunk of time, but it feels like the text revised, the TR version kind of buys them a little more time before they have to consider making any big changes.
Yeah. And I, at my job, there's a bookshelf just full of old books, and there's actually an old copy of the DSM-3. And
Oh,
I was pretty pumped. I'm going to go through it one day when I have extra time, which is a
yeah.
joke because I never have extra time. But I thought it
I
was kind of
feel that.
cool.
That is
Yeah.
cool.
So, from the American Psychiatric Association, common symptoms of SAD include fatigue, even with too much sleep. So, even though you're sleeping all day, you're still tired. Some weight gain associated with overeating and carbohydrate cravings. SAD symptoms can vary from mild to severe and can include many symptoms similar to major depressive disorder, such as feeling sad or having a depressed mood.
Next is having a loss of interest or pleasure in activities that you previously enjoyed.
Changes in appetite, usually eating more and craving those carbohydrates.
Hmm. The change in sleep that Justin mentioned, it's usually sleeping too much. So you get kids that'll come into your office that'll say, like, I slept 12 hours last night. I don't know why. How can I still be tired?
And on that note, too, I just noticed that the summer sleep schedule going back to the school sleep schedule is so
Hmm.
rough on kids.
Yes.
Like going to sleep at 2 to 3 a.m., waking up at noon, and then having to all
Hmm.
of a sudden get up at 6 a.m. for school is a
Yeah.
wild shift for young people to have to make.
Hmm.
And like, I would be miserable if I had to do that. So I feel for all you people out there who have to make those big changes in your sleep schedule.
There's a school in our area that I think, or a couple of schools, a school district that that's implementing some changes. So I think their older kids are starting a little later, and then their younger kids are starting a little earlier. Because apparently for like certain age ranges, the earlier is better. And I guess we might have a little bit of that in our school district. Our high school starts at 8:30,
Nice.
whereas our elementary school, I think they start at like 7:50. So I don't know. definitely depends on the age, but for us working with teenagers, yeah, 12, going to sleep at midnight, waking up at 10, 11, 12 in the afternoon, and then having to shift that by 5 hours, even more rough.
That's rough. That's hard on your brain.
Yeah.
Plus, you're absolutely right. A lot of studies have shown that a later start for adolescents in school really helps their school performance, but no
Hmm.
one really seems to be changing or doing what's best for kids because, they're just doing it the way they've been doing it for a long time. So, loss of energy, back to symptoms of seasonal affective disorder,
Hmm.
loss of energy or increased fatigue despite increased sleep hours.
Yeah. Another one is increase in purposeless physical activity. This was an interesting one. So basically, inability to sit still, you're pacing, hand wringing, right? Like you're fidgeting with your hands, or slowed movements or speech. These actions definitely can be severe, or they must be severe enough to be observable by others to count as a criteria.
Sometimes seasonal affective disorder can have feelings of worthlessness or guiltiness.
Hmm. There's also difficulty thinking, concentrating, or making decisions. Very common that we see with teens that get diagnosed with major depressive disorder without the seasonal pattern.
And on the more extreme end of things, sometimes people can even have thoughts of death and suicide.
Hmm. Yeah, important to remember. Just because someone is diagnosed with depression, just because they have depressive symptoms, the thoughts of death and suicide is not does not it does not a diagnosis of depression does not equal thoughts of death and suicide. I think a lot of people worry about that. I think a lot of parents worry about that too. We've mentioned it before, but there's like this assumption like, well, depression now means they're suicidal and now I'm really scared for my kid. We can pump the brakes a little bit. It doesn't automatically mean that. It might be part of it. It also might not be. You don't have to have every criteria to be clinically diagnosed. So, important reminder.
Yeah, very good reminder. Some stats and facts about seasonal affective disorder. So, the prevalence, how many people actually get it? Approximately 5% of adults in the United States experience seasonal affective disorder. And this is according to the American Psychiatric Association.
10 to 20% of people may experience milder forms of seasonal mood changes, and women are more likely to be diagnosed with 60 to 90% of cases occurring in women.
The typical age of onset is between age 18 and 30, but it can also happen at any time, at any point in someone's
Mhm.
life.
Maybe specifically with teenagers like we work with, like 12 to
Yeah.
16, 17, 18. um, your location may have an impact on it. So I talked about it earlier of like what parts of the country may experience it more, but research has shown that the farther from the equator, the higher the prevalence. So an example that they give is 1% of people in Florida diagnosed, or it's prevalent in Florida, seasonal affective disorder, while in Alaska, it's up to like 9% of people get impacted by it. Big
That's
difference.
fascinating to me, how
Yeah.
big that difference is between Florida and Alaska. And
Hmm.
I know that I've mentioned it on the show in the past that I did a rotation up in Alaska when I was in medical school, and it was in the spring. So it was April, May time period. And getting used to the sun going down at midnight was wild for me. It was
Yeah.
so much different than anything I'd ever experienced. And I thought, I am so glad I am on this side, on the spring side,
Yeah.
and not on the fall side and winter side when there's times in Alaska where the sun never rises and it's just
Oh,
completely, totally dark.
no, thank you.
Yeah, it'd be a
That would
lot.
probably get me. Yeah.
Yeah. And then typical duration of symptoms for seasonal affective disorder is about 4 to 5 months out of the year. So that's a long time for
Hmm.
people to be struggling and suffering.
Yeah, almost half the year. Some biological and environmental factors. One could be light exposure. So, reduced sunlight can disrupt your circadian rhythm and your serotonin levels. So, like Justin was saying, he was in Alaska during the springtime, but if you're there in the fall time and you're getting minimal sunlight, like the least like in the whole country, that can have a huge impact on you.
And I was even trying to look into the mechanism of this, and they think that sunlight actually induces your monoamine oxidase, which
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
is an enzyme that breaks down your serotonin and your different catecholamines, of course, Eddie.
Mm.
Uh, so it actually can enhance this enzyme to break down your serotonin and drop your serotonin levels in your brain. We're not 100% sure of the mechanism of why seasonal affective disorder happens, but I think it's fascinating that the light that comes in through our eyes actually changes the hormone balance in our brains. That's just
Mhm.
crazy to me.
Yeah. It sounded like I knew what you were talking about, right? With my
Yeah, you passed it off, you know.
Oh.
Also, people who with seasonal affective disorder, some produce too much melatonin.
Mhm.
And I know we talked about people who are oversleeping, sleeping too much, but still feel depressed. And that likely is because they're overproducing melatonin in those situations.
That makes sense. And then the last environmental factor and biological factor that we'll mention is vitamin D deficiency. If you know people who live in Oregon or the Pacific Northwest or places where we get a lot of clouds and rain, they tend to talk about the fact that they might be on a vitamin D supplement. So lower levels of sunlight can contribute to a vitamin D deficiency. I actually had a student and their family tell me recently that they had recently started taking a vitamin D supplement and that they were hopeful about these next coming months and the impact on their mental health.
I actually had a professor in my first year of medical school who was very aware of the fact that in Laramie, Wyoming, where I did my first
Mm-hmm.
year, that there isn't a lot of sun in the winter. And he would actually go out in the cold in his underwear. And I'm not really sure why he would do, but he would hold his ears. I don't remember why he did that, but he would hold his ears and like do squats out in his yard almost naked to try and get more vitamin D production, also get more like that was his way of trying to combat the seasonal affective disorder.
Was this related to seasonal affective disorder? Or are you getting it confused with something else?
He was trying to get more vitamin D by exposing
Okay.
his
Oh,
his
so he
skin to
wants
the
all
sun.
of his skin to be exposed.
Yeah, he also really was very detailed about telling me how often he measured his urine output. He was kind of a strange dude who were like, "Do you want to know what my maximum urine output has been?" And I'm like, "I really don't care. A
Like in
liter and a half."
ounces? Like fluid
Yeah,
ounces?
yeah. He would
What was the max?
measure. I think it was around a liter and a half. It was that he was able to put out that
What is
much
that in
pee.
ounces? I need it like,
Oh, let's check here.
here we go.
1.5 liters in ounces. 50 ounces.
Oh, shit.
That was his max. That was
Oh,
probably after, a
okay.
big night. So,
Okay. And an unrelated note, treatment for SAD. how do we feel better without needing to go outside in our underwear, pulling down our ears, and trying to get as much sunlight as possible? Well, I guess kind of related, light therapy. One study said it could be effective in 60 to 80% of cases. It might be a little more of a placebo effect, but that's totally fine. Placebo effects, in my book, count. If you feel better, that's all I care about.
yeah. And I think I'm really fascinated by, I know this is a bit of a out there tangent, but space travel.
Mm.
Like, are we doing this with astronauts? Are we trying to replicate
Ooh,
conditions on the Earth? Because our bodies are so in tune with the Earth and the different cycles of the Earth. And if we completely change that, how is that going to work in space? So I'm always curious about how those things are going to impact space travel.
that's a good point.
Plus 60 to 80% effectiveness, or people getting better like 60 80% of the time with light therapy is a really effective treatment. I
Hmm.
would say that's even more effective than most antidepressant medications too. So
Yeah.
if you're an all natural person and you have seasonal components of your depression and you want to try light therapy, there are hardly any side effects possible, and it's a very effective thing.
Yeah.
In combination, we always recommend therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy has been a type of therapy that has been shown and a proven treatment for seasonal affective disorder too.
Yeah. Can you tell me more about medications? Or are we using similar ones for major depression and the seasonal affective disorder?
Yeah, typically like SSRIs, the medicines that increase that serotonin in your
Hmm.
brain, can be effective for seasonal affective disorder. And I also learned in residency that there's an old depression medicine called Wellbutrin that
Hmm.
tends to be a little bit more of an activating, gives you a little bit more energy, actually doesn't impact your serotonin system as much, but more your dopamine and norepinephrine systems in your brain. That's actually a very effective medicine for seasonal affective disorder too. So there
Hmm,
are a couple of good options if that
nice.
is what you want to try.
Yeah. And then last thing, we've talked about it, and you might be familiar already, but vitamin D supplements, they might help mitigate the effects of SAD. It seems to be pretty common for people who maybe don't have a chance to see a therapist, just kind of know that about themselves, that each year around the winter time they start to get a little more low, so they have that on hand already. Seems to be effective. I can't say one way or the other through experience, but seems to be effective.
Yeah, and an all natural way of getting that vitamin D is exposing your skin to direct sunlight. You don't have to get completely naked by any means, but uh, I think if you do have seasonal affective disorder, it's important to be mindful of it and say, okay, I'm starting to get a little bit less light exposure. Maybe I should spend a little more time outside. Maybe I should get a little bit more light on my skin. That
Mhm.
could be something that helps. Now, bear in mind, my mother was actually a nurse for a dermatologist, so she would always say, like, don't get too much sun contact because then it increase your risk for skin cancer.
True.
But it can also help give you that vitamin D because your skin makes vitamin D with direct sunlight exposure.
Mhm. Wear sunscreen too.
Yeah, but then you don't make as much vitamin D. It blocks those
Shit, damned
rays.
if you
Yeah.
do, damned if you don't. God
Mm-hmm.
damn
Mm-hmm.
it. Other things to consider if you have seasonal depression, right? We've talked about the light box. We've talked about talking to your doctor. We've talked about going to therapy. It doesn't have to be all three. It can be just one of them. But definitely, if you start to notice like this is a pattern, we get to October, November, I am feeling impacted. It's okay to try to ask for help and know that it's not weird. It's not random. It's not a fake thing. It's a very real thing that impacts a lot of people.
So, one of our favorite things on this show is talking about different celebrities that have come out and talked about their experiences. And the first celebrity we want to talk about is Kristen Bell. And although she's more widely known for her advocacy around mental health and anxiety, Kristen Bell has spoken about experiencing seasonal mood changes that resemble seasonal affective disorder,
Mhm.
often referring to her need for more light and how the winter months affect her mental health negatively.
Yeah. Another one is Adele. She's mentioned a few times how much sunny Los Angeles has positively impacted her mental health. So that might be her roundabout way of saying that she gets impacted by the seasonal patterns and that impacts her mood. I will say in researching, there's a number of celebrities who have made comments saying that the colder, darker months impact them, but they haven't really explicitly mentioned seasonal affective disorder. So you can infer, but just wanted to mention that. Usually, when Justin or I do research and we see celebrities related to certain disorders, they'll explicitly say it. This was one where it just was kind of like you could take a guess and probably be right.
It's so funny looking up different celebrities and their mental health disorders and which
Mhm.
topics just have lists and lists and lists of people who have come out and said, like, especially
Yeah.
like bipolar disorder,
Hmm.
regular depression, anxiety. You can take your pick of celebrities you want to talk about who have had those things, but once you start getting into a little bit more of the niche diagnoses, it's harder to find. And it sounds like, yeah, seasonal affective disorder is not something that's on a lot of people's radars, which is one of
Yeah.
the reasons why we wanted to do this episode, bring a little bit more attention to it and tell people that it's okay. It's a normal thing that happens.
Absolutely. That's our first take home point. It's fairly common and it's definitely treatable. Don't be afraid to ask for help when it comes to seasonal affective disorder.
If you notice that you have mental health changes around certain times of the year, consider seeking help and getting help for this because you shouldn't have to suffer alone.
Yeah. And while seasonal affective disorder is not its own diagnosis, that doesn't mean it's any less important and that you shouldn't get help. You should definitely get help. I tell students all the time. So many students, when I talk with them, so many teens over the years will say, like, this is really dumb. I don't want to say it. And I have to remind them, if it's impacting you, if you're having a hard time, it is not dumb. It is important. I want to know about it so we can talk about it and get you some help. So, same thing with seasonal affective disorder. It's not its own diagnosis, but it's still very important. You still deserve to get help, and it's okay to be struggling with that because it's a very real thing.
And perception is reality. If you're feeling like things are bad during a certain time of year, then go with it. Like
Yeah.
a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm not sure. Every fall, every winter, things just get a lot worse." But I'm not sure if I have seasonal affective disorder. It's okay. And if you feel it, and if you if you understand it and see that pattern in your own life, that could be what is going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you all. We hope this impacts somebody out there listening and understands that this could be a real thing that's on its way, and how to treat it. We appreciate you all for listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever app you use. You know the drill. We're on there. Feel free to just leave us a 5-star review. You can hit follow. You can hit subscribe. Whatever it is you do on your app. On social media, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube at MillennialMHC and MillennialMHC.com. One last time, thank you all for listening. Again, this is Suicide Prevention Month. We hope that if you need help or you know someone that needs help, that they reach out and call the Lifeline or get community or county resources. And remember, take care of y'all mentals.
And no eating dogs.